we have a panel titled The Imperative of Energy Humanities, where energy, engineering, and the arts intersect. And I'd like to introduce to you our professor, Kathy Newman. She's an associate professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University. She'll be moderating our panel today.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Newman. I'm faculty in the English department, and I'm going to introduce the panel. I think they're going to sit here, and we're going to take turns giving some short presentations. Jacob Gessling is a PhD candidate in literary and cultural studies. His research focuses on 20th and 21st century American culture and cultures of energy. In his dissertation, Jacob examines literary and visual art that represents or uses coal waste, such as slurry ash and acid mine drainage, to call attention to environmental conditions and the history of coal in Appalachia. Abigail E Owen is a historian of science, technology, and environment. At CMU, she teaches history courses about the social and political aspects of water and agriculture, and a course called Introduction to Environmental Ideas for CMU's minor in environmental and sustainability studies. She is director of education for the Steinbrenner Institute for Environmental Education and Research at Carnegie Mellon University. Noah Theriault is an assistant professor of anthropology in the CMU Department of History. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's conducted extensive ethnographic research in the Philippines. His scholarship and teaching combine the tools of history, anthropology, political ecology to ask how relationships with the environment are shaped both by uneven relations of power and by different ways of knowing, valuing, and being in the world. My work in the English department deals with labor, culture, material history. I'm finishing a book right now called How the 50s Worked, Mass Culture in the Decade the Unions Made, and I'm curating an art exhibit that opens today, marks at 200, art that considers the relationship between capitalism and culture, recognizing the fact that Karl Marx turns 200 in May of this year. So my presentation asks about the relationship between culture and energy. What is the history of how we have cooked our food, heated our living spaces, lit up our nights, and produced things that we can enjoy from a cultural point of view? As I've begun to work at the intersection of this nexus, culture and energy, I've become convinced that energy history must become an integral part of cultural studies. We can't make or enjoy culture without energy, and at the same time, the kinds of culture we produce and enjoy are dependent upon the available energy forms at a given moment. I want to start with this very old example. Archaeological evidence for the earliest evidence of cooking with fire has been traced to the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa nearly 1 million years ago. This means that for the first 996,000 years of human life, the primary fuel for heating and cooking and the primary form of energy for creating light in the dark has been light from a fire, or a few thousand years later, light from candles and oil lamps. Is it any wonder that the earliest forms of storytelling were epic songs, poems, and dances told and performed around an open fire? Quite often when energy is defined in the modern era, we think in terms of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. So I'm arguing today that if we're going to think about culture and energy across time, we must broaden the range of what we think of as energy. And so here are the categories I want to sort of briefly introduce before we move to our panel. Energy for light, energy for heat, energy for cooking, energy for transportation, energy for industry, and energy for electricity. So my second argument is that all forms of culture require energy for their production, dissemination, and consumption. To create books, we need heat, light, today a computer. We need the energy that fuels the factory that makes paper, prints the words, and binds the book. We also need the energy that fuels the shipping of the book. And we need heat and light to make ourselves comfortable while we read. My third argument is that culture is often engaged in the project of representation, of telling stories about forms of energy. Many of our folk tales, for example, take place in the woods, where for nearly 1 million years, humans had to forage for their most important form of fuel, firewood. So I'm just going to zoom us through some of the history connected to these different forms. In 70,000 BC, we see the invention of the primitive oil lamp that was usually burned, made of stone and burned animal fat. 29,000 BC, we have the earliest earth ovens. 8,000 BC, we have the earliest evidence of the pressing and use of olive oil, which was used for cooking and lighting. 3,500 BC, the first domestication of horses and the invention of the wheel. 3,000 BC, we have the earliest known sailing vessels. 2,000 BC is we find that the Chinese were the first to use coal as an energy source. By 1300 BC, it is common for homes in Greece to have a central hearth. And here is a Turkish king who installed radiant heating in his castle. 500 to 200 BC, we have developments in lamp and candle making. 200 BC, Europeans harness water energy to power mills. In the 10th century, windmills were used in Persia, and in the early 1400s, the first cast iron stoves. In 1400s, the first chimneys. 1590s, the mastery of windmills by the Dutch. 1600s, the use of coal coke in England. So this really marks a break. I want to point out that for most of human history, firewood and animal fat, olive oil were the primary things that were used to heat and light. And so 1600s, 1700s is the big break with coal. There's the increasing reliance on whale oil and lamps in this period. Coal becomes the dominant energy source. 1712, we have the steam engine, which allows us to pump water out of coal mines, which increases the extent to which we can mine and use coal. 1748, the first commercially produced coal in Richmond, Virginia, and this is Coal Hill in Pittsburgh. What is Coal Hill called today? Who knows? Mount Washington. 1790s, the beginning of gas lights. A steam engine was invented that could be used to heat homes. 1821, first natural gas well in the US. 1825, coal-powered trains. 1860, the first solar-powered system invented in France. 1863, invention of radiators. 1870, the early Standard Oil well. 1882, Edison's Pearl Street Power Station. 1892, the first geothermal system built in Boise, Idaho. Paris World's Fair features an engine that can run on peanut oil in 1900. 1901, the famous Lucas Gusher in Texas. 1902 is Spindletop, Texas. This is basically a year later. You can see the growth in oil production. And so really here, at the end, I want to pause and wonder why at the end of the 1400s, there's a printing revolution. Was this made possible by advances in the quality of lamps and oil that gave writers, inventors, and printing press operators enough light and heat to do their work? It admittedly, however, the increasing cultural dominance of books coincides with the rise in Western technologies to extract and harness fossil fuels. We also have movable type invented in China, and here shows the European output of books by century. So again, I think that the kind of explosion in book technology goes with that sea change we see when we move to coal as our primary fuel. And I'll end with an example of how culture reflects trends in energy. I just want you to think about all the folk tales that take place in the woods. There's a famous Korean folk tale called The Woodcutter and the Fairy, a wish-granting tale. The plethora of woods are dangerous stories, from Robin Hood to Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel and Goldilocks, the Three Bears, and the most famous woodcutters in American history, the Tin Woodman and Paul Bunyan. So today, please join me in welcoming our panel that's going to think more about the connection between culture and energy. Jacob is up next. Thank you.
All right, so the short talk that I'm going to give today is called Energy Waste in the Public Eye, Using Art as Advocacy. And it's part of a dissertation that I'm working on that looks at various ways in which literary and visual arts talk about coal waste, use represent substances like slurry, ash, and acid mine drainage as a way of kind of thinking about the contemporary environmental issues related to coal. To say a bit more about just kind of where this project is coming from, and thinking about the way that we kind of think about climate change in culture, I've noticed two main tendencies in how we talk about these things. So the first is there's a tendency to kind of think in terms of global collectivity, that we all kind of share the same air, we all kind of are going to have to deal with the similar environmental problems. We all share the same, a planet's finite resources. And this kind of coalesces in a concept that geologists have put forward called the Anthropocene, that kind of takes the recent history, or our history of fossil fuel use or just resource use in general, and marks a geological era where we can actually kind of read the human history in the geological record. So there's this one tendency that universalizes, and it kind of competes with a second kind of, or overlapping tendency that looks very much at the individual. So when we think about the way in which we respond, everyday folks kind of can respond to an issue like climate change, we think about our individual choices as far as what cars we drive, what we buy at the supermarket. It kind of takes this global problem and turns it into something that's very much something that we can see in daily life. And so there's these two kind of overlapping tendencies that I've been thinking through. And what I've noticed is that there's the absence of kind of like the way in which regional histories or kind of specific areas have their own kind of stories about kind of fossil fuel use, resource use that are just as much kind of should be a part of the way that we think about these more global issues in the present. So what I'm going to do is just kind of talk through a few artworks by one particular artist that I'm writing about right now. This is kind of an example that I thought was has a pretty good kind of illustration of some of the neat kind of technical techniques that that artists are using. So this is by the artist John Sabarol. He's a painter from Southeast Ohio. And Sabarol has worked with an environmental engineer to develop a technique where they collect acid mine drainage out of waterways. They let material settle, they spark certain chemical reactions that kind of reduce it down to iron oxide. They have purified water that then they put back into the stream where it came from, and then use the iron oxides to create pigments that are used in the art. So you can see a little bit just kind of about the process here. And so what Sabarol has done is he kind of has developed a certain technique where he lays out aluminum discs and then mixes this acid mine drainage-based pigments with water, and basically starts to kind of put the water on, drip the water onto the aluminum disc to where colors layer, and it creates kind of a bubble of water that then dries over the course of weeks to kind of leave this resulting artwork. And so we have an example of this here. And there's a way that his art kind of takes something that we would think of as an environment, or that's an environmental hazard, kind of by working through it, kind of creates these images that do have a certain extent of kind of a natural beauty, especially kind of in this blues. It's something that is a much more kind of relatable in how we think about environmental art. You can see here as an example that's a little bit more cosmic in its colors. Okay. All right, so what I'm most interested in is how this art doesn't just kind of convey an environmental message. You don't get kind of much meaning by just looking at this art. But instead, I'm interested in how something like this or a series like this is an entry point into initiating a larger conversation about the environment. So in this case, what you have is this art that Sabarol creates these works of art but also that these art, in the way that he talks about his art and the way he frames his art, it's all about the process. That this right here is just a tool that enables him to speak more about issues related to acid mine drainage. The ultimate goal that they're currently working on, I think they have a Kickstarter for this that's almost funded, is basically they're trying to work to create a large-scale plant to where they can continue to produce these paints at a commercial level, and then use the funds to further clean up acid mine drainage sites and things like that. So it's the art isn't the kind of the important thing here. It's how it opens up a conversation. On that note, I wanted to include these images here. These don't use the acid mine drainage pigments, but he has another series where he etches underground mine tunnels onto discs as a way of kind of getting people to talk about the way in which we've kind of recorded history underneath the surface, the way that we've kind of have these images that are kind of an artifact of the industrial era that we can talk about. You know, I see this as part of a project that is both kind of helping us to think through some of the current environmental problems that are related to fossil fuel use, but also just kind of ways in which we can think about how culture can help us to think through some of the longer term ways in which we've used resources and have related to energy in our society. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about some of the how in energy humanities. I'm a historian, and I'm going to look at some of the materials that I can use as a historian to do the work of energy humanities, to think about humanities and also think about energy and the science and engineering of it at the same time. This is one example of knowing just enough about the language of science. I think it's really important to know what's going on inside the world of science and engineering, not to be a scientist or an engineer, but also to be able to use that language and to understand just enough to ask our own questions, our own humanities questions. So for example, in this diagram, which is a primary, secondary school diagram about the water cycle, we can see that groundwater is really an important part of the water cycle. Understanding some basic language and basic science of groundwater can help us to understand a community's relationship to fracking when perhaps one neighbor has signed a contract for fracking on their land and the other neighbor has not. So understanding those social and political and rhetorical dynamics at the same time that we understand the geological basis for disagreements and arguments. Another way that there is intersections between the work of energy, the science and engineering of energy and humanities is simply by using maps. Place and space, images and maps are really important for my discipline, history. Physical geography are, of course, really important for energy. Energy resources are situated in physical geography in the crust of the earth, whether it's coal and oil or shale, or whether it's uranium to propel nuclear reactors. People are also situated in geography. So a historian like me might ask about those people. Who are the workers on the oil rigs? Who are the coal miners? Who are the uranium miners? Who are the hydroelectric dam construction crews, and what's involved for the risks that they take? Another way of situating people in place and space is ethnography, so understanding people in their geographic situation. And my colleague Noah Theriault, who's an anthropologist, might talk a little bit more about this. The humanities give us a lens to understand relationships between people, place, and space. One way to do this is ethnography. So for example, I love this book by Mandana Limbert, who's an anthropologist. She went to the Sultanate of Oman, which is in the middle of an oil boom, and she wrote this book, The Time of Oil. And Limbert talks to everyday people in the Sultanate of Oman to find out how they understand their relationship to their new financial circumstances, how their life has changed socially as well as financially, their frontiers and their educations. But it also changes their understanding of the future itself. These people understand, everyday people understand that oil is not forever. So that is included in their understanding of the social and cultural world around them. A textbook I really like to use in teaching is this history of engineers. I wind up teaching a lot of engineers, undergraduate engineers in my courses in history. And this author, Jessica Teich, tracks the projects and the mindset of engineers who built California's infrastructures for water and mines and dams in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the author tracks those same exact engineers, the same people, as they traveled and designed big projects all over the world, for example, in Hawaii, in South Africa, and in Palestine. So this study is about expertise and the way that experts assume and implement their authority in engineering for energy projects. But for engineering students who read this kind of work, they wind up getting some context for how engineers did their work in the past. And they also get the social context that made a real difference. So they understand that the social assumptions, the social context, created a lot of the situations where engineers were asked to solve problems and to create new energy systems. And it leads to some reflection, usually, on the part of those undergraduate engineers about what they're going to do when they leave the university and when they become engineers out in the world. One way of talking about energy being situated in geography, in this case a hydroelectric dam, is that the power of the dam is directly related to the power of a river, which is a natural system. By studying a river and by studying the humans who have historically used, lived on, taken fish from, and understood the river in different ways, this particular study of the Columbia River is a classic river biography. There are many river biographies out there about many different rivers. And it puts dams like the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Dam in social, historical, and geographic perspective. Sometimes dams create beautiful archives. This film, Hydro, is part of the huge public excitement about the construction of dams from 1939, when people were really excited about electricity showing up in their homes and businesses. This dam video is available on YouTube. It was made public by some wonderful archivists of the Bonneville Power Administration, which is the administration that still manages the dams in the Columbia River. And this film, Hydro, is usually apparent to students who are savvy in the ways of propaganda and media as a propaganda film about creating a new energy installation. But at the same time, it's also a very beautiful film. It takes advantage of some of the best in the Works Progress Administration's film experts, and it has a full orchestral score. It's really beautiful, and it's really compelling, and it reminds me of some of the stories that my own grandmother told me about how excited she was when electricity came to her rural home. Maybe 90 years ago. She's no longer around, but I remember her stories, and this film conveys some of that excitement. Digitized records are also the work of archivists. Archivists do really important work for historians like me, also for anthropologists and literary and cultural studies. They maintain documents and materials, and we live in this era when a lot of these archives are beautifully digitized and available to us who want to study them without having to travel, and without having to handle the documents with our own hands. So here we have some beautiful archives with illustrations of fish and canoes from the journeys of Lewis and Clark on that same Columbia River. And then sometimes archives give you these little gifts. This photo on the left is a photo that I found when I was doing research on a dam that was investigated by the World Bank, and the past director of the World Bank, Robert S. McNamara, had visited this dam, and I found this photograph, which I thought was really beautiful, of him overlooking the dam. The rest of the archives of the dam were quite boring. There were contracts and numbers and tables and memos that I had a hard time understanding. But then I saw Steven Spielberg's beautiful movie, The Post, about a particular moment in 1971, and I realized that the actor and the costume designer, the set designer, had done a really good job investigating what exactly Robert S. McNamara might have looked like, dressed like, and moved like in that era. So archives sometimes can give you gifts like that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Noah Theriault from the CMU Department of History, and my talk is entitled From Standing Rock to Susquehanna, How the Environmental Humanities Can Illuminate the Politics of Energy. So thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Dr. Newman for organizing the panel, the Energy Week organizers for including us in the lineup, and also those whose labor keeps this campus clean, safe, and functioning day in and day out. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we're gathered today. For thousands of years, it's been the land of Indigenous peoples, including peoples whose names have been lost to conscious memory, as well as to the Susquehanna, Haudenosaunee, and other nations at various points in time. Today, this region remains home to many Indigenous persons from across Turtle Island, and I would like to express my gratitude to this land and its Indigenous guardians for the opportunity to live, work, and form kindred here, even as I remain an uninvited guest. I wanted to begin today with a land acknowledgement, not only because it's important to recognize the settler colonial condition of our society, but also because it helps orient us to the perspective that the environmental humanities bring to conversations about energy. My aim today is to show why we need anthropology, history, and philosophy, and in particular, why we need the perspectives of Indigenous scholars in these fields if we want to understand the disputes that surround energy extraction and transport in North America today. These disputes, I want to suggest, are about more than how the costs and benefits of particular projects or industries are distributed, and they're about more than climate change. To understand what's at stake and the seemingly irreconcilable struggles we're seeing in places like Standing Rock to our west and the Susquehanna Valley to our east, we need to sensitize ourselves to the historical, cultural, and ontological context in which these struggles unfold. Let's begin by considering a proposition that rose to prominence amid the struggle at Standing Rock. Water is life, a translation of the Lakota principle, Mini Wachoni. Although I cannot speak for Oceti-Sakowin water protectors or for any Indigenous communities, I want to suggest that water is life is more than a protest slogan and more than a truism about the ubiquity of water as a necessity for life. It's an ontological proposition about the nature of being and about the distribution of life or vitality in the world. Only when we understand this proposition as such can we begin to fully appreciate what's at stake in resistance to energy projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline. As everyone here is surely aware, we live in a time of rapid, if volatile, expansion of oil and gas extraction in North America, from the tar sands in Canada to the shale plays of the US plains in the Northeast. Along with this comes an expansion of associated infrastructures, from the drilling rigs and the pipelines whose proliferation over vast areas is provoking intense controversy, to the adjacent industries like the ethane cracker being built about 150 miles to our east. Part of what makes these infrastructures controversial are the physical risks that they pose to the nearby communities, from those living in the so-called blast zones to those whose soil and water may be contaminated. Another controversial aspect, of course, is the connection to climate change, with many calling for a scaling down rather than an expansion of fossil fuel development. And yet another still is the question of property rights, with some landowners angered over the use of split estates, forced pooling, eminent domain, and other tactics to override their dissent. These are the sorts of concerns we are most likely to encounter in media accounts of what happened at Standing Rock. And all of these issues over physical security, health, regulatory fairness, and property rights should inform our understanding of what happened there. But what many media accounts and commentaries did not address is what, in my analysis, matters most: the long-standing struggle for Indigenous sovereignty in response to violent colonial occupations and Indigenous conceptions of personhood, kinship, and accountability that inform that struggle. In the case of Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline was more than a potentially hazardous infrastructure project. It was the latest chapter in a long story of dispossession and forced relocation, from the U.S. Army's 1863 massacre of Sioux persons at Whitestone Hill to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dam projects that altered sacred rivers and displaced communities in the 1950s. In the words of Oglala Lakota historian LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who founded the Sacred Stone Camp at Standing Rock, quote, "Where the Cannonball River joins the Missouri River at the site of our camp today, there used to be a whirlpool that created large spherical sandstone formations. The stones are not created anymore ever since the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged the mouth of the Cannonball River and flooded the area in the late 1950s as they finished the Oahe Dam. They killed a portion of our sacred river." Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powes-White adds that stopping DAPL was about stopping a vicious pattern of U.S. colonialism that inflicts immediate environmental harms and future climate change impacts on Indigenous peoples, unquote. So we need to bear in mind the history behind all of this, and that's obviously something that the humanities can bring to the table. But we also need to understand what's at stake ontologically. In August 2016, Oglala Lakota scholar activist Ayuskin American Horse wrote, quote, "Our elders have told us that if the Zuzeka Sape, the black snake, comes across our land, our world will end. Zuzeka has come in the form of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and so I must fight," unquote. His invocation of the black snake points to the cosmological and ontological underpinnings of resistance to the pipeline. Calling themselves protectors and not protesters, the resistance by Ocheri Sakoen and their allies cannot be reduced to a defense of nature in the Western sense of a pristine wilderness, nor to a protection of water as an inanimate object or resource, nor for that matter to a defense of territory. LaDonna Brave Bull Allard points out that the pipeline threatened to desecrate, quote, "places held sacred not only by the Sioux nations, but also by the Arikara, the Mandan, and the Northern Cheyenne," unquote. This sacredness comes in part from the inhabitation of these places by divine beings. Writing of the philosophies of Great Plains nations, Blackfeet Métis scholar Rosalind Lapierre observes that, quote, "The Blackfeet viewed water as a distinct place, a sacred place. It was the home of divine beings and divine animals who taught the Blackfeet religious rituals and moral restrictions on human behavior. It can, in fact, be compared to Mount Sinai of the Old Testament, which was viewed as holy ground and where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments," unquote. But this sacredness also comes from the role that these places play in maintaining kin relations that extend far beyond those one might have with one's living human kin. Linking the Standing Rock water protectors to the Idle No More and the Black Lives Matter movements, Dakota scholar Kim Tallbear describes all three of these movements as having been founded by, quote, "badass women who caretake relations," unquote. The relations she's referring to are kin relations, but as a Dakota scholar, she uses kin in ways that contradict patriarchal white settler ideas of kinship, according to in her words. The kin in question are the spirits of ancestors, generations yet to be unborn, and other than human relatives of many different forms. So with all of this in mind, we can understand that resistance to the pipeline was, to a significant degree, about honoring these more than human kin relations and protecting them from an existential harm of cosmological proportions. It's worth recalling here that colonialism is not just a project of material, territorial, and ideological subjugation. It's also an ontological and cosmological project, one that seeks to subjugate and eliminate indigenous worlds. Tallbear further writes that in addition to the genocidal violence that settler colonialism has effected in North America, quote, "another eliminatory tactic has been to sever our sustaining relations with our other than human relatives," unquote. Political theorist Audra Mitchell describes such acts of severance as transversal violence, suggesting how colonial projects involve not just physical coercion and erasure, but also the imposition of colonial temporalities, cosmologies, and ontologies. Time, being, and the cosmos itself are at stake. We can appreciate then that what was at stake at Standing Rock was also more than a culturally significant landscape. It was the very power to determine and enact what constitutes life. Elizabeth Povinelli describes this as Gianto power, which, she writes, operates through the regulation of the distinction between life and non-life. U.S. settler colonial society operates according to a secular biological conception of life and a human exceptionalist, possessive individualist conception of personhood, to say nothing of the racialized, heteropatriarchal structures through which these conceptions have been variegated. These conceptions fundamentally shape how our institutions function, and they fundamentally shape how we relate to one another, to other than human beings, and to the land itself. And these relations are fundamentally different from those that were being defended at Standing Rock. Life itself is what's at stake in the politics of energy today, and this is why water is life is much more than a slogan. This is this challenging proposition, but it's one that the environmental humanities can help us face. Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. This question, I think, could be answered by each of one of you to know your opinion. It says, what should scientists and engineers learn or apply from a humanities approach?
Well, I would say, along the lines of what I argued in my talk, that you can apply a sensitivity to the fact that different communities have very different worldviews oftentimes, and not just in terms of sort of surface level cultural differences that we're fairly familiar with, but sometimes at the very fundamental level of like different ontological assumptions about the composition of reality and the place of humans or sort of communities of beings in relation to their landscapes and to one another. So I think it's about cultural sensitivity and a sense that what's at stake is not just resources, but sometimes something like more intangible or difficult to measure, say, with the tools of economics or social sciences.
I would add and agree to that. For example, 100 years ago, eugenics, the science of race and racial hierarchy, was taught in universities as a real science. This was 100 years ago, and there were engineers who were doing projects that were implementing these concepts, these social assumptions, at the same time that they were doing their dam construction or their community building or settlement building. And for engineers to learn about this, to learn that 100 years ago, engineers who were doing good work, solving engineering problems, were also reflecting and using and implementing these other social ideals is really powerful for engineers to learn about and to understand, because it makes them reflect on what might be the social context, what might be the social assumptions in their own time that they are reflecting and furthering without perhaps even realizing it.
And then, something that I'd like to add is just I think that something that the art that I look at kind of brings to the table is a way that kind of encouraging us to think at different timescales. So thinking both at, we think often about like what the life of a certain project might be. But something that I think is interesting about the acid mine drainage project in particular is how that brings together, a century, at least a century of resource use in the region. That it's something that we see this art that's based on this substance that's been in the process of being created for 100 years, and so not to mention coal itself. So we have just these ways in which these kind of objects, these cultural objects, can just help us think more thoroughly about time.
Yeah, I would add to that an observation about time. I think something that I found really humbling about thinking about the timeline of the relationship between culture and energy is how short the fossil fuel age has been. And while we're incredibly dependent on these technologies now, most of human history has been without the kind of resources we take for granted and that we are running out of. So a lot of our dystopian narratives imagine a world beyond fossil fuels, like Walking Dead. There's not a lot of electricity in Walking Dead, for example. So I just want us to be humble in our thinking about what is our right to these resources, and that we've had them for a very short time, and that we may not have them for much longer.
So the next question is related to this. How do we build curriculum to reflect this philosophy? Curriculum.
I think that providing accessible historical examples is one way to relate to humans in the past and see how we might be doing things differently or the same right now. It's a great awareness builder. I think history, I'm a historian, of course, is without parallel in that case. So I think that knowing how we got to where we are, and also being really conscious about where we're at and what our discussions for the future are, and seeing that, in fact, we are embedded in some social assumptions and some mindsets is really important. I also think that having language to cross disciplines is part of this. So for humanities, I think having the language of science as part of our discussion, not to be a scientist, is important. And I think the same for science and engineering, having the language of humanities, understanding what a close reading is, what a critical reading is, what an image analysis is, what a social analysis is. I think that all of this is really important. So getting some of each and each.
Yeah, and on that note, I also think that issues like energy and the environment are something that cuts across disciplines so well that it enables students to kind of not just think about their their immediate work, but to how their work connects to a range of disciplines and how they can draw from that. So in teaching first-year writing classes based on some of these topics, it's interesting to see folks who might not enter into the semester wanting to think about social problems at all, walk away understanding the way in which engineering is very much connected to these decisions we make as a society as far as how we use resources. So it's a way that we can just kind of, as Abigail said, have that common language that we can connect all of these different approaches to problems together. And then the next class I'm teaching is on waste, and so that's again something that's very much a cultural object that we see in our everyday lives, that touches on design, on engineering, on all of these kind of problems. So it's again this common symbol, this common something that allows us all to come together to think about broader environmental issues.
I'll just talk very briefly about a class that I teach called Environmental Literature. It's a 19th century literature class. And I make the students go on 5 nature walks during the course, and the walk has to be at least an hour, and they can't bring technology on their walk. And students have told me it's the hardest assignment they've ever been given at Carnegie Mellon. So I think what we're all trying to do is really kind of peel things back and take students, just kind of remove, again, some of the things we've become dependent upon to think about what was Thoreau's experience. And even if we can't recreate it, what would it mean to be without our technology for an hour?
Thank you very much to our panelists. A fascinating talk. Thank you.